Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our EDC coffee chat this morning. We have our NOLA Lobbyist, North Olympic Legislative Alliance Lobbyist, Josh Weiss on with us this morning. Josh has been working with us for, is this the fourth year, Josh? Yeah, fourth year, wow. And so we are really honored and excited to have him on. And we're lucky to have him as our lobbyist and consultant. He's very well respected by the legislators, including our legislators in Olympia. And formerly, if you didn't know, he used to be the Director of Government Affairs for the Washington Association of Counties. So with that, I will let Josh take it, and I think he's going to give us a high-level overview and then talk about the NOLA priorities, 3 priorities that kind of consist in buckets, which I think is stretching him a bit. But and then you guys can probably ask questions about particular topics that he may know about, because he's got a lot of different clients that work in different areas, primarily in the government space and local government space, right? And so he's really an expert in a lot of things. So with that, Josh, take it away.
Thank you, Colleen. Nice to see everybody. I need to do this more often. That was an awesome pump up of my ego. I appreciate that. The other space I'll just add that I'm in Commissioner Johnson and I met back when I was working with the timber industry. I have timber private forest landowner clients as well, and including up on the North Olympic Peninsula. So yeah, it's been really great working with NOLA. So we have just finished our process. The steering committee has finished their process establishing their priorities. I'm now in the process of, or will be in the process of, sort of refining those priorities and figuring out how exactly to communicate them to legislators and getting into sort of the implementation phase of this. I'll just step back before I do that and say that give you a little bit of overview for the session, which will start January 9th. The wheels have really started rolling with the submission of all the state agencies have provided to the Office of Financial Management their requests for budget needs, which kicks off the process of starting putting together the state biennial operating capital and transportation budgets. So those all went into the governor's office. The governor's office will sift through them and come out probably about early mid-December with the governor's proposed budgets. Those are not binding on the legislature by any means. In fact, usually the legislature takes those and starts from scratch. But the concepts that get included will certainly form at least a basis of discussion for the legislature. On top of on top of all the other ideas that legislators bring in to the room. We have heard the latest state revenue forecast is that this current biennium that we're in, which will end on June 30th of 2023, the state revenues are still continuing to grow more than expected. They're about another $40 million more than was anticipated, which is, sorry, I don't have the exact number. In rough terms, that's a couple $2 billion more than what they anticipated when they left town at the end of this last session. So revenues have really continued to grow, which is partly being driven by inflation, right? Anytime you're paying more on sales tax for goods and services, the state is getting a higher percentage of that, so their revenues go up. And we're seeing that across the country, actually. Despite this current biennium being projected to grow, have more money than anticipated, next biennium, the 23 to 25, for the first time since the pandemic hit in 2020, when those revenue forecasts were obviously in steep decline. For the first time since then, we're actually seeing a projected revenue decrease in the 23 to 25 by about 400 million. So the message we're getting from legislators, and particularly from the governor's budget office, is that there's not going to be nearly enough revenue, even though it's grown significantly. There's not going to be nearly enough revenue certainly for all of the things the agencies are asking for. And probably, sufficient to maintain the current levels of spending that they have after you include the increase of things being more expensive, providing services over time. The other factor that's going on is that the governor has negotiated cost of living increases for state employees. Those will be significantly expensive. And essentially the legislature is fairly bound. There is a process where they can not move forward with the cost of living increases that the governor negotiates, but it would be pretty difficult for them to do. It would be politically difficult for them to do. So kind of the message we're getting at the beginning of the session is, yes, there's more money, but all of it's accounted for. So don't come in asking for additional spending. The same is, and that's on the operating budget. The same is true on the capital budget. Let me back up. Even though that is not totally atypical for budget writers to start a session saying, don't ask for money. That's kind of the typical message. All of us that are in the advocacy world will still be asking for money. And there will, we completely anticipate that there will be still some new items funded. On the capital budget, it's kind of a similar story. We would anticipate this would be a bigger capital budget year, more opportunities to get capital items funded. The state does have several big ticket capital items that they're going to need to fund. The one that we keep hearing the most about is a replacement facility for Western State Mental Hospital, which where the individuals that are severely mentally ill and to the point that they are criminally dangerous, that's where those individuals go for treatment. And there needs to be, I think it's almost $300 million worth of work that needs to be done there. So there will be continued some opportunity in the capital budget, but maybe not as much as we were hoping for. And then on the transportation budget, we just passed a relatively large transportation package last session, based largely on the receipts of new revenue that will be coming in from the state's new carbon cap and trade system, which will be going into effect at the end of this year. I think if I remember correctly, the first auction for to purchase allowances in that system, which will generate money for the state, happens, I think it's in February, but it will be happening at the beginning of the year. And right now, the state is actually, Ecology has just adopted final rules for that program. They're actually projecting that those revenues are going to come in even more strongly than predicted. All of that revenue, though, under current state requirements, have to be spent on programs and activities that will actually reduce carbon emissions. So in the transportation world, we're not expecting new transportation revenue. We're really anticipating much more of a conversation around how to spend new carbon money, whether any of the projects that are funded by new gas tax and increased fees from the Move Ahead Washington package, whether they can continue to be funded at the levels that they were originally planned, and when they will get scheduled to be constructed. Remember, that was a 16-year package, and the legislature did not program out when those projects would be coming online. So my sense at this point is that a lot of the conversation around transportation will be around sort of reshuffling those carbon dollars and any gas tax funded projects that were included in that package, which were very small. So that will be, major task of the legislature this session will be working through those 3 biennial budgets. We also know, it'll be a long legislative session, should get done sometime in April. maybe early May. Hopefully not going past that, hopefully not going into special session. Last time that really happened was when we had budget problems during the Great Recession, and we do anticipate Democrats continuing to maintain control of all chambers. So we're really hoping they won't go long this year. There is still a fairly hearty appetite in the majority for new policy proposals. So there will be the typical, hundreds and hundreds of bills introduced. The timelines to get those bills through will be longer. So we anticipate more bills actually getting passed this session. Major topics that we know they're going to focus on will continue to be housing. We know that the public safety conversation is going to continue to be a hot item. If you recall, we're tracking the Supreme Court's decision on the Blake case, which essentially said that a person could not be held liable for possession of hard drugs, cocaine, methamphetamines, heroin, those types of drugs, non-marijuana drugs. Our current law was unconstitutional. And so in 2021, the legislature put in place a sort of stopgap policy approach, which said an individual would get 3 strikes, 3 times being caught by law enforcement with possession of hard drugs. The first 3 times they are caught, they would be referred to, first 2 times they were caught, they would be referred to like drug court or treatment alternatives. After the 3rd time, they could be referred to typical, detention, incarceration pathways of enforcement, which is what we have had in the state before. That system actually expires at the end of 2023. So the legislature will be that's a long way of saying the legislature is going to be re-examining that policy decision this session, and has had a work group that's been in place for the last year and a half looking at that. Their recommendation to the legislature will be to continue the current policy. I think that will be incredibly controversial, and I think it's far from clear whether the legislature will do anything. Remember, and if there will be the majority votes in the Democratic caucus to actually bring a bill that changes the status quo up onto the floor. If the legislature does not act, then the status quo will be the Supreme Court's ruling, which is strict possession, simple possession of hard drugs will not be a criminal offense. And we know that public safety is a conversation across the whole state. We're seeing tons of discussion about that. And so I think that'll be a very interesting dynamic and probably very difficult for the Democratic majorities to work their way through. And, we'll see our 24th district legislators be right in the pinch point on that discussion as being members of the Democratic caucuses, but also being from more moderate areas. I think they'll be more sensitive to the concern to need to do something proactive on public safety. So housing, public safety, the decarbonization conversation, I think, will continue. Electrification. Those will be some of the topics I think that'll be top of mind for legislators. So that's kind of the general context. I think it's going to be a robust policy environment for this session. I sort of already alluded to this from a political perspective. We're just under now 3 weeks away from the election. You may be not too surprised, for me to say that we don't anticipate major changes in the legislature. There are a few key races where there are seats in play that you could see Republicans pick up a few seats. It does not look in Washington like it's going to be the red wave that was predicted. I say all of this with a huge grain of salt because I personally, and I think people generally, are terrible at predicting electoral outcomes. And we were surprised in the primary by the impact that the US Supreme Court decision on Roe versus Wade had, that clearly drove the Democratic base to get out and vote in the primary. The major question is going to be which base gets out to vote during the general. Is it the more conservative, moderate base that's concerned about inflation and public safety, or is it the more Democratic/liberal base that is more concerned about reproductive rights? So we'll just have to see. But our prediction again is that probably not significant change here in Washington.
Josh, can you speak to, so this is diving into a specific, if that's okay, but there was a ruling, a state Supreme Court ruling recently, and about prevailing wages and how those are set across the state. Can you give a little bit of background on how it's done and then what the latest is?
Yeah, and this does tie into the NOLA priorities. So that's a good transition. Thank you, Colleen. We try to keep NOLA to 3 priorities. And a large part of that is because, legislators really like to see entities and organizations make priorities. They do get inundated with a lot of different interest groups and individuals bringing lots of different issues to them. So as focused as we can be, it is helpful for them. So I really pushed NOLA very hard to limit their priorities to 3. One of the 3 priorities this year is under an umbrella. I will say that I have pretty much failed in my attempt to try and keep NOLA focused. 2 of our priorities this year are really umbrella priorities that are sort of topic areas that have lots of sub issues. But what I'm really finding with NOLA is that there is the strong desire amongst the steering committee and amongst the region to more than try and bring home specific individual projects or try and pass narrow specific legislative proposals, really to raise the legislature's attention, specific issues and problems that are unique to the region. And so one of those priorities in particular is focused on that. And what we've got it called right now, state policies that negatively impact poor and rural communities. And one of my jobs, as I sort of alluded to before, is to try and get that narrowed down or articulated in a way that rolls off the tongue and is a little easier for people to grasp. But one of those issues underneath that topic is prevailing wage. And the fact that both Jefferson and Clallam counties in this region, our prevailing wages are so consistently tied to wages in the central Puget Sound. And, just the disconnect in the region between the idea that you're going to be paying somebody the same wage in Port Angeles that you would in Seattle. And just the fact that the local economy doesn't support that. And the connection that has to bringing in contractors from out of the region. And that has to do, this gets to Colleen, your question. This is a long way of getting into your question. The way the state sets prevailing wages, there was a law passed, I think it was about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, that says prevailing wages will be based upon the collective bargaining agreements that have been negotiated by the unions in your region. So, carpenters, masons, whatever the particular union might be, if you have a collective bargaining agreement in your region that sets the wages for that service, that will be the prevailing wage that Department of Labor and Industries will adopt for your region.
But they negotiate that with AGC, Associated General Contractors, that's in Seattle.
Right.
And so these unions, which may not have any members in our counties, negotiate with AGC that doesn't have any members in our counties. And then those wages are established what governments have to pay for any contracts, local governments.
And part of the conundrum is that even if you have a collective bargaining agreement that only applies in, say, one city in your region or in your county, it's going to apply to the whole county. So we have a fair amount of overlap, and as Colleen said, a fair amount of connection to those Puget Sound wages. The other, if you don't have any collective bargaining agreements, just finishing this out for the sake of clarity, if you have no collective bargaining agreements, then L&I will come in and do a survey. But part of what Colleen has really demonstrated and really effectively showing is that, doing a survey of one or two businesses in your area, is not scientific whatsoever. So the AGC actually challenged the state law and went all the way to the Supreme Court. Just last week, we got a decision out of the Supreme Court. AGC's argument was that using that negotiated process, which is not state controlled at all, is essentially an unconstitutional delegation of legislative authority to a non-state entity. The Supreme Court just ruled last week and said that was not the case. They overturned all the lower courts and said the state statute is constitutional, that there were sufficient statutory protections in place and directions for how the wages would get set, that it was not an unconstitutional delegation, and the state statute stands. So one of the things that we have been thinking under this umbrella topic of unfair impact on rural and poor communities was bringing up prevailing wage, thinking that if the Supreme Court had ruled that the system was unconstitutional, that we would have an opportunity, the legislature would have to consider a new method for setting prevailing wages, and we would have a window to get our views included in there. I think with the court's ruling, that window is closed, and we'll have to be thinking of other ways to be talking about this prevailing wage issue. So that was a very long answer to your question, Colleen, and way to get.
But it settles something for us, right? And allows us to narrow what we'll be working on. But for residential prevailing wages, so if Peninsula Housing Authority or any of our governments work on an affordable housing project, they have to pay residential prevailing wages. And an example of an issue there, and they're supposed to be doing surveys. Our prevailing wage rates for residential carpentry was $71.32 an hour, which was twice that of King County's, which is $36.44 an hour. And the reason was they surveyed two businesses in Clallam County in 2017. And one of those two businesses was Neely Construction, that's out of Puyallup, that only does government contracts, and they are union, so they only pay the union collective bargaining agreement wage. And so we got set with that as our wage for Clallam County, and that certainly is not true prevailing wage of what carpenters are paid in Clallam County. And so it just makes it much more expensive for our local governments to actually build any affordable housing. So there, I've complained. I feel better now.
You've complained, and you've been more than complained. You've really documented how exactly this is playing out. And I know you've been really effectively advocating with our legislators as well in pointing this out. So this will be one of the sort of subtopics that we'll be tracking this legislative session under this negative impact to rural communities. And Colleen's done a great job of laying out several different subtopics. One of them is data issues and the need for agencies, including L&I and Employment Security Department, to be sharing data and sharing that data as well, not just with each other, but with local ESDs. Training issues and the fact that we can't get the type of training and apprenticeship opportunities, skill centers in our rural region. Procurement issues, The fact that there's a disincentive for local contractors to be getting work. And so a lot of the public works dollars that we're spending in the region are actually going to out of region businesses. And, a lot of that is tied to apprenticeships as well. So I know this is kind of a big topic. And one of the things that I'm planning on doing for NOLA this year is the legislature continues to be very interested in apprenticeships in particular, rural economic development to some degree, looking for bills that get introduced on these topics that we can use as a platform to talk to legislative committees and have NOLA Steering Committee members do the talking on our behalf about how these policies play out in rural, economically disadvantaged communities. So that is sort of one umbrella topic that we'll be working on. And I know Representative Chapman has expressed an interest in introducing a bill, holding some work sessions on these topics, and we'll be playing through on that as well. And Colleen, I don't know, you and I haven't talked in a week or two. I'm not sure if there's anything more to share about sort of where Representative Chapman might be on that. And you don't have to share it now if you don't want to.
Yeah, he wants us to be working on writing a bill, an omnibus bill. And so I think that's, and also Rick Anderson from Department of Commerce had said he would help write it as well, if that's something, Josh, you want to have happen. And I've got some, I've shared the latest information about how LNI is setting these residential prevailing wage rates with our 3 legislators, and I have met with all 3 of them. And it was enlightening to them, I think, a lot of it, but they also want to know what of these issues could be handled by talking to the director of the particular agency like ESD or LNI. And we did, Senator Wellman also has been helpful, and she spoke to Joel Sachs, the director of LNI, and his comment was basically, we're following the state statute that you legislators wrote. You need to change the state statute, and agreed that it's not a good process.
So let me plow forward, Colleen, if that's okay, because that's one of 3 topics, and we can circle back. Oh, let me say one more thing about this. Underneath that umbrella, NOLA is including extension of the 0.09 economic development for rural counties issue. That's the Economic Opportunity Fund in Clallam County is what it's called locally. We know Representative Theringer is going to bring this bill forward again. We also know since our steering committee meeting that the Association of Counties has actually made this one of their top priorities. So they'll be pushing on it. So we'll be supporting that effort on behalf of NOLA and looking for opportunities to support that bill too. The second topic has to do with housing, and we had a subcommittee, a number of individuals from the NOLA Steering Committee that got together and talked about housing. This is also an omnibus topic that we want to talk more broadly, and we'll be looking for opportunities with the legislature to be sort of talking about the impacts in our rural communities. We really identified a number of subtopics, but the idea is this is an entryway into the broader issue of housing and the need for workforce housing, and the fact that, even in economically struggling communities, housing is very much a limiting factor, and it's very expensive. One thing that was identified was supporting legislation that will give the opportunity to purchase their homes, people that live in mobile home residences. And if their park is getting sold, the ability for the community to band together basically and buy it as a co-op. And there has been legislation on this that hasn't passed yet. It has been done in other states. So supporting that legislation when it comes forward again. We also recognize that there's there needs to be funding, incentives and subsidies as much as possible, including providing sales tax exemption for affordable housing construction. This was brought forward last session. It didn't pass, but will be discussed again. Expanding the multifamily tax exemption, which is a property tax exemption for builders to build multifamily housing, not necessarily, it can be market rate, but multifamily housing, and then additional higher subsidies for affordable housing within that too. So one of the other topics we identified within this subtopic was the need for some regulatory relief on this type of building of housing, specifically calling out the impact that the Department of Ecology's stormwater permits has on building, and just the fact that local governments have to update their permits every 5 years is really pretty expensive and difficult. And that's one way that we can make housing less expensive, is to make that a little bit easier to comply with. And then the last sort of subtopic is creating stability for larger projects and for infill development. Supporting the state's continued effort to make the building of condos more feasible. Condo liability right now is really viewed as a problem in the state. It's something the legislature has worked on for several years now, since at least 2019, and will probably be continuing to work on. Providing additional appeal exemptions from SEPA, the State Environmental Policy Act, so that cities and counties can basically move forward with residential building in areas that are zoned and already permitted. Not having to go through the SEPA challenge process would be helpful. And then there was just a new requirement that was put in place, that all planned unit developments have to go through the formation of homeowners association, which is expensive and is considered a barrier. So again, on this, a lot of different subtopics, we'll be looking at a lot of different opportunities to be talking about how housing, the reality of housing and affordable housing in areas like the North Olympic Peninsula. The multifamily tax exemption, I see, Colleen, you asked. Yeah, right now it is limited to certain populations. Smaller cities can't use it. There also, yeah, I think that's the bottom line, basically allowing additional cities to be able to use the multifamily tax exemption. It is an option.
I believe Port Townsend has it in some areas, and Port Angeles has made it available throughout their city, but City of Sequim does not qualify, nor does Forks.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so that's 2 of 3 priorities. The last one is continuing our work on the upcoming cliff that will be happening for electrical apprentices. If you recall our discussion from last year, we worked pretty hard, actually, kind of led the charge on trying to change state law or allow the North Olympic Peninsula an exemption from the current requirement that will be coming in place in July 1st of next year, that any electrical apprentices that are getting hours towards their commercial certification, starting on that date, they'll need to be in a formal apprenticeship program. So they won't be able to basically do work study to use hours towards that certification. And what we've heard, right, with lack of apprenticeship opportunities, or only apprenticeship opportunities for electricians in the North Olympic Peninsula, the closest is Bremerton, or Puyallup, I think is the other one. It's
actually, I think so. The union has it just right here, but you have to be union, and there were only 10 that were union trainees, out of 198 between our two counties. And otherwise, so non-union training is all the way over in Puyallup is the closest. There's nothing in Bremerton.
Thank you. That's awesome. So we'll be bringing this issue up again. We'll also be looking, there was a bill that was introduced last year that we piggybacked on. But this is something that we know our local electrical shops are very worried about. And frankly, all of our business community should be worried about, because as soon as shops lose that ability to have trainees that aren't in an apprenticeship, it's going to become a lot harder for businesses to find electricians to do their work. So that is a mouthful. Those are our 3 priorities. Those are the areas that we're planning on working in. And as I kind of mentioned before, with the exception of the electrical apprenticeships, which I think we have a pretty unique role in actually trying to push that issue forward, even if the legislature doesn't bring it forward independently. The other 2, I think we'll pretty much be trying to, like I said, piggyback and look for opportunities to talk about how to communicate and educate legislators about the unique challenges that our rural and economically distressed county communities are really struggling with. So that's where I'm at. I'd be happy to talk more, answer questions. Maybe I'll be quiet for a little bit and see if you guys have more to add or questions.
Raise your hand if you have any questions. I would love to know if Association of Washington Counties, or I did that. Cities and Washington Association of Counties, if either of them have set their legislative priorities, and are those published?
Yeah, they're both in various stages. AWC, the cities, has adopted theirs. They are available on their webpage. I don't know if I can recite for you off the top of my head all of them. The Blake issue, public safety, is one. The need for additional behavioral health services, mental health treatment, is one. They are very concerned about housing. Thank you, Cherie's putting that in the chat. There's a link to their priorities. I feel like, infrastructure, continue to talk to the legislature about the need for access to state infrastructure programs. There's probably something else there that I'm not remembering, but they're all there. The counties have adopted, their legislative committee has adopted their priorities. They will take it to their general membership in about a month for final adoption. I'm sure they'll adopt it without discussion. I'll see if I can find the link while I'm working on this. Their 4 priorities are extension of the 0.09. This is a real test. I haven't thought about this. Did I mention I was on vacation last week in New Orleans and Nashville and Memphis? It's some of these brain cells haven't been activated in a couple of days. They also are supporting discussion about how the state will share federal infrastructure dollars with local governments. There's been an agreement reached with transportation leadership on that is important for them to support. I know AWC will be doing that too. I'll have to look at the other 2. I apologize, but I'll see if I can find it right now too.
Want me to jump in, Josh? This is Kate.
That would be great. Thank you, Commissioner.
Sure. I'm the co-chair of the Legislative Steering Committee for Association of Counties. The other 2 are coming up with equal access standards for behavioral health services. And 4th is funding of jails.
What does that mean, equal access to behavioral health services?
I can take that, Commissioner, if you want.
Thanks. I was trying to unmute.
Would you want to take it?
No, you go ahead, Josh.
Thank you for the reminder. I don't know how I could forget those 2. So essentially the issue that counties are in a different role on the provision of behavioral health services, because they're essentially county boards of commissioners are also the board or sit on the board of your behavioral health administrative organizations, the BHASOs. I'm not sure if that's actually the name, but they are the entities that help provide the connection between the providers that are providing the services and, making sure that people aren't ending up in the county jail, and sort of trying to set the bigger regional perspective on what is needed in the region. What's happening when the state integrated behavioral health and physical health in I want to say that was about 2013, 14, maybe. What they did was basically said, okay, managed care organizations who are basically your health insurance companies and are drawing down Medicaid funds, you're going to be responsible now for providing mental health services. So they are now in charge of contracting with those service providers that are providing you. When you go to your doctor, the idea is they can refer you to a mental health provider, and there would be the integration there to essentially draw down additional Medicaid dollars. The problem, and that is all managed at the state level through the state healthcare authority. And healthcare authority is actually the manager of the contracts. The problem is now that your county behavioral health organizations don't have any particular way or role to make sure that there are adequate service providers in your region. So just because an MCO is providing services doesn't mean that there's actually the workforce, doesn't mean that there's actually the providers, doesn't mean that they have enough contracts in place to actually get people service. Or alternatively, maybe there are service providers available, but the waiting list is so long, it takes, can take months to get somebody in to actually see someone. I actually heard about this from Snohomish County, which you would think would have, bigger urban area would have very good provision of services. They, are saying that it can take 2-3 months for somebody that is not in critical care or critical need to get service. And what the counties are really raising is there needs to be some accountability for the state healthcare authority to provide those services in a timely and sufficient manner. There's currently no state standard for what is too long for somebody to wait for service. So that was probably a fairly long-winded explanation of that basic assumption. And Commissioner Dean or Commissioner Johnson, if you want to provide additional, I know you've worked very closely in these issues. If you want to provide additional nuance or detail, please do.
No, that was great, Josh.
And I'm still looking for the link to their agenda or draft agenda. I'm not sure it actually has been put on the website yet, since it is only, it hasn't gone to the full membership for adoption.
So if Representative Theringer is going to run the bill again, does he have a companion sponsor in the Senate? And since Washington Association of Counties are making it a priority, do you think then WEDA and WEDA is the Washington Economic Development Association, and WPPA should be rethinking that? I'm on the legislative committee for WPPA, which is the Washington Public Ports Authority, our association. And I know they talked about 0.09 as supporting, but not necessarily, making it one of their top priorities to advocate for, because they didn't feel that anyone else was going to be pushing for it this year.
I don't know where those two organizations are in their process. I know Colleen, you would have a better sense of that. I think I was under the impression that WEDA had already adopted theirs, but perhaps that's not accurate.
Well, and WEDA is hiring a new lobbyist, so I think they're kind of in flux right now.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I can add too that Senator Lovelet is taking a lot of interest in this issue. It'd be great to have a new champion for it in the Senate. So we should follow up with her, Josh.
That's a great point. She was super helpful last session.
And what county is she from?
She's in the 40th legislative district, and that includes.
She's in Anacortes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay,
Whatcom and Skagit.
okay. But Whatcom didn't qualify because they're too large and they're not considered rural. So is she proposing for Whatcom? They become, they've tried this, border counties, not just rural counties, should get 0.09 funds. Is that part of her position?
Yeah, so Whatcom and Benton are the two counties that grew out of the definition. And Representative Theringer's proposal the last several years has included, it has basically maintained the status quo, includes any counties that have been previously eligible.
Okay.
And I would be very surprised if Senator Loveland would move away from the inclusion of Whatcom.
Mm-hmm. Benton sure does well, though. I mean, they're not economically distressed by any means. Just saying. They've got P&L there with 1,000 PhDs and $1 billion of federal money that gets invested into their communities regularly.
I don't see everyone just following up. Sorry, I don't think WASAC has posted the draft list yet publicly.
Okay.
I can't find it.
So the odds are, though, that this will be a 90-day. Do you think a 90-day session, or do you think it'll go longer than that?
105.
Excuse me, 105-day session. But do you think it'll go past 105 days?
I hope not. There's no good reason for it to.
Mm-hmm. One thing that Representative Theringer talked about, which I think is a really high bar to achieve, but it makes sense from a process standpoint, is to do something similar, to have sessions that are similar to what the federal government does. And so to have a month or 2 months, I don't know, whatever the amount of time is, a month where bills are proposed, and then the legislature takes a break for a couple months. And they come back to their communities, talk about, here are the bills that are proposed, give us input, and then go back and vote on things after they get local input. And, that probably would allow, it would be a slower process, probably a lot more, conversation, but I think probably better outcomes. And can you speak to that idea? What are the chances something like that would happen?
I think there is better chance than maybe in the past, though I would say it's a very high bar. And my recollection, don't quote me on this, but my recollection is that the deadline, the timelines for the legislative sessions are set in the Constitution, in the state constitution. So my gut reaction would be, you'd have to look and see whether or not you would have to amend the Constitution, I suppose, because it prescribes when the session starts and for how many days, and the process for calling special session. The question then would be, could the legislature just make an administrative change for how they operate, and still fit within the parameters of what the Constitution calls for, or if they'd actually need to do an amendment? I do think there is, I think there's a low chance that happens, but I think it's a really good idea. I mean, what we're really seeing more and more is that legislative work and legislative engagement does happen year round. The days of having interims where there wasn't really much happening are really gone. I mean, even I've been doing this for 25-ish years, and in that time, I can see a huge difference between the way it used to be and the way it is now. And the other dynamic that's changed a lot too is just the public virtual involvement, just like this, has really changed. And I think that there's almost more desire at the general public level to be involved and participate in workshops and hearings and those types of things. So I don't know, that's my 2 cents.
Mhm.
But I think it's a pretty high bar. It's going to be hard to do something like that.
Mhm. Has there been much discussion about the Washington State Building Council's proposals to change building code, which requires more, our county has a housing solutions committee, and we signed a letter saying that, ideally they look at a cost benefit ratio of, if you're going to add more energy requirements to a new unit, a new house, residential house, consider the cost increase versus the carbon reduction in, the cost benefit analysis. And I have you been hearing much discussion about that? I mean, usually that committee has kind of gone under the radar, but I've been hearing a lot more about it lately.
Yeah, I mean, their action on energy efficiency has really, pushed them to the forefront of everybody's consciousness. And the legislature has been talking about it. It's been a little bit more of a discussion point for the minority party. I think the sort of core liberal Democratic portion of the Democratic caucus is perfectly happy having the council push those issues forward aggressively. It's very front and center for the majority objectives to decarbonize the state. I think one thing that has happened is you are hearing more about the cost. You're also starting to hear more about energy supply and energy demand, and the fact that not even challenging the goal of electrification, but saying, okay, assume your goal is more electrification, how are you going to accomplish that? And some of this has been brought about by the discussion around whether or not to keep the Snake River dams, which is not, obviously doesn't impact our region, but it's been a burning debate, right, for much of Eastern and South West Washington as well. But just the idea of reducing electrical generation capacity at the same time that you're trying to increase electrification. I do think that whole conversation around what is our overall, the other thing that's driven it, also, in national news is the fact that the fires in California in particular, which are happening more and more here, often are impacting electrical capacity. And the drought that's happening in the American Southwest right now. I just was noticing this morning an article about how hydroelectric generation capacity in Colorado, California, and I think it was Nevada, is at the lowest level it's been since the mid 1960s. So, this concept of there's not a limitless supply of electricity, or electrical supply can be impacted, is really gaining more conversation. So I think electrical capacity is going to be an issue as it relates to decarbonization, increasingly.
Mhm. All right. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask? Or do you know of an initiative that in your particular work area that is happening that you could get Josh's perspective on? All right. Well, I'm not seeing any. Oh yeah, Jim does. Go ahead, Jim.
So back to the very beginning, Josh.
Can't really hear you very well, Jim.
Exactly what's going on right now.
Your speaker isn't working very well.
Let me put it in the chat.
Okay. All right. And in the meantime, Steve Bierman had a question about education. And I know Bill Dowling, who is our Olympic Workforce Development Executive Director, they've got some proposals. Do you guys want to share what you're thinking there?
Well, thanks, Colleen. Yeah, our package is in with ESD's line budget, and it includes an additional, I think about $15 million in the general workforce system, including an expansion of EXA, the Successful Poverty Program. We've taken advantage of that quite a bit up here in Clallam and in Jefferson counties with those folks who are 200% of poverty. It really enables us to do a lot more work with them, additional dollars there. The last portion is also really important in that bill, which is a funding for expansion of business services, what we refer to business service in our areas. And that would actually be something we would probably be looking to contract with the EDCs in the area, because we would be given enough for two full-time, and maybe look at how our rapid response works, ties together with your team's, Colleen, or NDOC's team. You know, we're going to look at what the options for that are. As part of that program for the general dollars, we're looking at expanding our youth experience programs in the area as well, trying to get more work experience for in-school youth. We currently aren't able to provide in-school youth services, working just with transition or opportunity youth, those who've dropped out. We really want to see it as a dropout prevention. If we can get good work experience with local businesses, we think that's a way to keep young people engaged in school and keep them also focused on opportunities and careers, really see something they can do. So that's it for ours. It is supported as a priority in WIDA's agenda as well. So we're hoping to really get a good, robust group behind that.
Great. All right. Well, I'm sorry, Jim, we couldn't hear you. Oh, he wrote here. As far as the external fiscal environment, is it accurate to say that the only federal money coming to the state will be from the federal infrastructure bill?
If you say new federal money, I think that is mostly correct, Jim. And I should have, and that is a good point, which the state has not appropriated all of the federal COVID relief money yet. And so they still have some sitting in reserve. I don't know how much. So that will be a discussion about how to spend those dollars. And I do think yes, there will be a discussion about the federal infrastructure dollars, and probably beyond even this session. I can't definitively say that's the only federal money though. But those are certainly the big pots that people are thinking about.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Josh. It's 9 a.m. I think that was a great review. It'll be a busy session as always, and we really appreciate you joining us today and giving us an update and educating us. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. Nice to see everybody.
Great to see you. Bye-bye.
Take care.